Continue with Jerome Delli Priscoli, who is a Senior Advisor at and Governor of the World Water Council. And you can read, I think we would have the presentation of the individual speakers refer that to the book that we all have gotten. So please.
Thank you very much. All Holiness, Eminences, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for inviting me to offer you some reflections on what is the nexus, or what I see as the nexus of water policy, some theological insights and some ethics. And I'll try to frame it within the broad issue of the abandonment or defending. As you know from the background material, my background is in political science, economics, a little bit of theology after that, and I've spent most of my life working with the engineers. And so that's where I'm coming from in this, and half of that has been in mediating conflicts. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to write a work with the Petrie Chair of Archaeology at the University of London. And during that time, this was for the Director General of UNESCO, I was quite struck by some of the metaphors we found in literature over thousands of years, people who would never communicate or talk to one another. Throughout history, we would find poets referring to water as humanity's carrier of collective memory. Poets as old as ancient China and 19th century Gerard Manley Hopkins. We hear today's scientists speak of the same water recycling through us in time and space. And if these molecules of water are carrying information, well, I can leave the rest up for you in the imagination of what's happening. And Jung looked at water as a symbol of the unconscious. Those of us who have dealt with mediation and conflicts know there's something a lot more that ties us together in water. And that's partially what these words bear out. But when we look at water policy, which is my world mostly, it's remarkable to me that the water decisions that we discuss become very close to equaling ethical decisions. Look at how we look at some of the major social ethical decisions we make and how they relate to water. Water is a common good, water and human dignity, water is a facilitator of well-being, rights and responsibilities of access, justice, and water, and the fact that water as a symbol of reconciliation, healing, and regeneration appears in virtually all of the known organized faith-based religions. So today I'll just look quickly at some of the disaster situations that we've been talking about, a quick, very, very quick policy context of these actions in the US with some lessons in Katrina. But then I'll make an appeal to changing the discourse on world water issues and how we look at this, and some concluding 4 points on how I think this nexus fits. The two windows of my personal understanding and experience to this, the windows to how to look at these integration and nexus, really come first from a new and better understanding of our creation stories, which is why I enjoyed so much listening to the creation discussion on the first day. And secondly, the pastoral dimensions. That is the experience part of actually trying to deal with these issues. When we look at water and related disaster situations in the world today, the way the international insurance industry looks at it, look at the value concentration is more and more in the urban area. Megacities in the 1950s, you can see where they are located around the world. The megacities in the year 2007 is quite dramatic if we want to take a look at where we may see vulnerabilities. The urban populations are growing with a projection of 60% of us living in urban areas by the year 2030. When we look at the Earth at night, you can see this lit up, and then when the insurance people look at it, they see value concentration all along the coasts of the world. Population in our coastal areas is dramatically growing, but today, 1/10 live within 5 kilometers, 2/3 within 200, 1/3 within 50 kilometers. When we look at people and disasters, the figure is somewhere around 70–75% of those suffering from disasters are suffering from water-related disasters. It's enormous, and it's growing, and the impacts and damages are growing. So we should ask ourselves the question, if so many people in the world are affected, how much of the hurt, the damages, the impact on them is ever reimbursed in any particular way? So here we see some of the losses and the insured losses, and you can look at these trends. But what I think is more interesting is, you won't read all these numbers, but what these show is some of the costliest floods in the 21st century, and it gives you the amount of loss. This is from an insurance analysis. But more importantly, the percentage of those losses that was insured. So the black boxes I put up there really are the rich countries. These are the countries where the insurance losses are 50, 60%. The big disasters occur in the other parts of the world, in the poorer parts or the transition parts of the world, have virtually no reimbursement at all. So, you heard John Briscoe talk yesterday, and I won't spend a lot of time on that, but the real question to be put in front of us on this: are these rich countries protected because they are rich, or are they rich because they've invested in that protection, which has allowed socioeconomic creativity and economic activity to occur? That's partially what's at stake here. To look at our own neighborhood, in this city, many people call a Caribbean city. And those of us who work here know what that means in trying to work in the U.S. system along with the systems and how government works in this part of the world. But in the Caribbean itself, the Inter-American Development Bank has emphasized the risk profiles are growing for the kinds of water-related disasters we would talk about. But interestingly enough, the emphasis remains on response, what happens after the disasters. There is very little concentration on what we do before the disasters. To put this in some more perspective from the World Water Watch, the large countries in the world are rich nations, and you can see the huge amount of impact in dollars, which is the blue. But the percentage of losses of those rich countries is very low. The poorest nations have much less loss, but that loss as a percentage of their wealth is astoundingly high. So high that it probably debilitates their ability to do much of anything. We have recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, with the World Bank and several others, been looking at poorer countries in Africa and other parts of the world. You saw one of these graphs yesterday. This is another one. Essentially, these lines show precipitation flows up and down with fluctuations in GDP. I should say that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of GDP as a measure, but I am using it here in a very broad sense as a measure of social economic activity and wealth. But the point is that we're seeing an enormous variation in this GDP related to the precipitation. Our inability to deal with the highs and the lows of that precipitation is a major factor in this particular problem. So much so that the estimates are between 25 and 30% of that fluctuation due to this inability. What is the point of aid if that is actually true to a country, if it's anywhere as close? Some figures in the United States. Now, for all the structures that have been built and what we have done, and we look at this over time, actually this country, by the way, is one of the few that tries to collect data on damages prevented. That means, essentially, if you do some kind of a project, what kind of performance did that project show you in different disasters? It's been astounding to me to find that this phenomena we want to talk about, very few countries collected. But the story here is with this huge investment, the investment has effectively reduced that rate of 25% to about 4%. And interestingly enough, when we study Japan, the Netherlands, and others, somewhere is around 4 to 3% of damages as a percentage of GDP is what we find. So in other words, we have a dynamic phenomena, not simply the number of disasters, but we are looking at the relationship of those disasters to the capacity of the society to function, which itself is dependent upon a number of other issues. So it's the impairment to human activity and creativity that really is the key, not just the number of events. I put an example here to measure that as damages as a percentage of GDP. So, should people be allowed to live in the coastal areas at risk? Well, you know, I'm not in the academic world, but I'll take that privilege and say it depends. But seriously, the risk itself equals the probability times the consequences that we see. But the consequences themselves are really a function of the political and social culture and whatever risk reduction investments are made. Those investments don't necessarily have to be dams, they can be a lot of things. The probability is really the scenarios of the future we see in the historical understanding of variability, not just the projections of that future variability. Now, this is all framed by the way we see and accept uncertainty. So to answer the question, it depends, let me ask a few questions to you in your own minds. Do we move people? Where do we move them in various situations? Do they have space? Talk to the Japanese about that, for example. Talk to the Bangladeshis about that. Also, for those of you who are like and understand the relocation regulations, for example, in the World Bank, can you imagine applying those regulations to 10 million people, 30 million people? If we want to relocate people, will we consistently use the regulations that we already put on the lending agencies? And if we're not going to, what are we going to do? Do we help people adapt where they are? Or do we mitigate causes, and what causes? What do we say to New Orleans, Indonesia, Bangladesh? So, to sum this quick framing up, the main triggers to these human concerns that we've been hearing really are water-related: droughts, floods, storm surges, and on. These are the traditional concerns of the water managers. The water managers have and continue and have always been dealing with variability. From the times that you had the priests advising the leaders of countries 1,000 years ago about when the floods would come or the droughts, to the synthetic hydrologists who themselves quite frequently act as theologians in our own business, I must say. This is the whole reason humans have become engineers. They become engineers because they want to reduce the vulnerability. And why is that important? It's important because it then liberates other energies in the society. The investment in managing the variabilities is the key to creating a platform for socioeconomic transformations, not just growth, transformations, and breaking what we call the cycles of poverty. The water actions themselves have been the key social actions for adaptation in a very uncertain environment throughout history. In the United States, the thing is, you've been listening to all of this, and I've watched the eyes sort of glass over in some cases about this because it's really complicated to understand some of the system. Let's look at when this country began in the early 1800s, at the end of the Revolution. 1808, Thomas Jefferson sent Secretary of Treasury Gallatin, asked them to do a report. They did a report that framed the way this country looked at its resources, water resources, for 100 years. And what did that report say how we should use the resources? Remember, it was only 13 colonies, and the big Mississippi and the fights with the French and everything here. So what do they say? They should be used to build political unity in a nation, these investments. Secondly, national defense, and that's because of the huge defense importance of this river. Economic development. The first court cases to establish federal control, not federal control, federal influence over the states, which are sovereign in this country, were on water. In the 1920s, the Congress asked the Corps of Engineers to look at every major river in the United States for its multiple uses. Now, they didn't talk about environmental flows, but they did talk about fish and other environmental issues. Over a period of 50 years, 260 of those were done, and they're quite serious because they framed the plans for the Tennessee and many other rivers. So the context to remember in this country is that we have political sovereignty of states. Local governments have control over zoning. States have control over the water. Federal government can only act in certain specific circumstances that have evolved over time. And it's in that environment that we have to talk about all of this. So we look at Katrina. Right here we have this, this volume was referred to. This was a history of decisions that were taken since we became interested in, as a country, in the hurricane protection in this part of the world. It asks what decisions were made, why were they made for this? Now, the summary of this is that we really have what amounts to a tyranny of incremental decisions. We first thought we had a whole system. We lost the vision of the system. New information emerged over time, but it never got integrated in any particular way into a system. Through this whole thing, because the local cost sharing, meaning the locals have to pay a certain amount or a little or a large amount with the federal government, with the states, that concern and the concern overall of economics and finance made the whole thing look myopic, because what happened then is those concerns began subtly to affect the engineering design and the capacity of the whole system. So we had a kind of a perfect storm of decisions over 30 or 40 years. It showed some of the major weaknesses in our system, and I don't mean the system necessarily of the hurricane protection. I'm talking about the system by which we make political economic decisions here. It produced, most of the world is talking about integrated water management. Two of the main components are decentralization and political technical dialogue. We have that, serious decentralization and serious political technical dialogue. But what we got was this incrementalism I just mentioned. So some of the lessons are, we were not really able to address the whole system's performance. We really weren't able to address the risk and the consequences, and we're not, in the overall social picture, we have not had an effective way to say, do we abandon or inhabit? Or to what degree do we do that? It's very, very difficult. So the question that's put before a democratic culture is, can we do it in a democratic culture? Serious question. So to solve this, the last two areas I want to look at are, let's change the terms of discourse in water. You remember this graph that John Briscoe put on yesterday. Type 1 countries, the developing countries, they have in many ways have a completely different interest. They need to have structures in some cases. They need investments of other types in water. And on the other hand, we have lots of investments, and our focus is on managing and not so much on hard investment. Now, the point is, if you happen to be a type 3, like we are, well-meaning, want to help the world, and we bring our solutions to type 1 countries, it shouldn't surprise people, like it happens to me all the time in Africa with African water ministers, who they say, why are you here? If you are going to tell us to do X, Y, and Z, leave. We need to use our water. Tell us something different, because we are living with a different set of realities. We often don't know the values that underlie the assumptions that we bring to then prescribe to others, even though those prescriptions are good for us and well-meaning here. Give you some reality. About 6 months ago in the World Water Council, we brought a bunch of people together on the water and climate change symposium that we had and discussion. We don't have to go through what best practices and no regret are, but what's interesting is if you look at this pattern, you have an exact mirror image between the developed and less developed countries and exactly what should be done. And this just isn't about politics. This is about the values and what people need, what millions and millions of people actually need. So, a quote from Pope John Paul in 1988, I think illustrates some of this. Subjecting poor nations to the imperialist structures of sin that deny them the freedom and development, new forms of technology transfer must be found, because today there are frequent cases of developing countries being denied these. In our own country, take a look at this. Imagine a place, for example, where we had no electricity, where the people who lived there had no toilets and outhouses, where the power was mostly horsepower, 60%, no lighting, no refrigeration, subsistence farming, ruined soil, flooding. Imagine that kind of a place. Many of you have probably seen it. It's not part of Africa today. It was the Tennessee Valley in 1935, which is just up the river here and dumps into this river. The point is, if you could speak with those people in the Tennessee Valley in 1935 about the values they had and what those values would reveal to how you should use and not use water, what would they say? Actually, we can. You can go to the Smithsonian and listen to their voices. So, caution. Moral judgments of the past decisions made on the basis of today's values are very, very dangerous. Be careful about that. Final conclusions to wrap this up. First, there are several models we could present to. I obviously come from a Christian background, so I mean, I'm not talking about Buddhists and Hindus and so forth, but there are many possible approaches, Christian approaches, to how we may look at this phenomena. I prefer to take out of these that are offered in this particular matrix a creation-centered approach, where in effect we're looking at co-creation, and we are looking for what I would say nature becoming conscious of its own design. Let me explain that as we go through this. 5 conclusions. 1, I think we have to build a new ideological and ethical consensus on what we're doing around water. Now, this means focusing on the common ground between the engineering means and the environmental ends that we think we have. But it also means we must move beyond equilibrium. It's the status quo and preservation notions. Talking too much about preservation and restoration is really getting dangerous because we are not restoring and preserving. What we are really engaged in is a collective design process, co-designing with nature, co-designing with God, what we think our home, our ecology should look like. Because you can't define the baseline. Nature is always changing. So we need a new teleology, a new sense of purpose for this water and what it's doing. And that purpose is usually subservient to some other sense of where humans want to go. Finding a new balance, then, of the sacred and utilitarian is what we're at. So I would say we need to avoid the temptation that in the name of saving creation, the material world out here, we don't destroy the co-creative or the co-design process that God has set in motion with us. Ratzinger, before he was Pope, said only when creation and covenant come together can either creation or covenant be realistically discussed. The one presumes the other. My second conclusion, I think we should avoid the materialist temptation as the animating ethic in water policy debates. Since nature is change, what does the preservation and restoration mean, like I just asked? What does stopping climate change really mean? Are we saying we're at the end of evolution? I don't think so. Are we creating heaven and earth? I don't think we really want to do that. I had many discussions with Harvey Cox when I was teaching at Harvard, not in the theology department, but other places. And I was taken in his recent, maybe 5 years ago, book with his reflections and the course he taught about when Jesus came to Harvard. He was reflecting, as we talked a lot over the years, about how to service this wonderful need and enthusiasm the students would bring for environment and ecology. And I think his words are interesting here. Care must be taken when linking the resurrection with ecology. The Christian view of the future, initiated in the resurrections, includes both the earthworms and the black holes. Many students, he's referring to the students at Harvard who are taking his classes, look to her, Mother Earth, not just as our mother, but also as our savior, a role for which the earth is plainly not suited. Exalting the earth into a goddess Gaia is ill-advised and fails to appreciate that she shares our finitude and our mortality, and eventually will burn to ash also. And also, I was reminded in our discussions of this with Teilhard de Chardin's notion that the earth is as the altar on which the mass of life is constantly celebrated. My third suggestion, I think we need to adopt a preference for people and the poor. So therefore, we should be asking what our water policy prescriptions really mean to the poor in the world. Gandhi once said, poverty is the worst polluter. You remember those charts about investments and the ability of those investments to then spawn creativity and growth and transformation. The Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican tradition speaks of has a prayer, give us all the reverence for the earth as your own creation, that we may use its resources rightly in the service of others and to do your honor and glory. There's a lot in that, as we know. 4, I think we need to find a new understanding of how humans and nature interact or what we mean. I think we should avoid the temptation that in the name of the material, we should avoid placing humans as the problem to eliminate. I know nobody wants to eliminate humans as such, but if you live in the policy world and watch what the ends are, and if you look at what the objective function would be, even if you approached it asymptotically, that's what it comes out to very often. So we have to avoid, by building policies and regulations with the optimizing function, that there's no human trace, and is the optimal really no humans. Pope Benedict, in his recent encyclical, said that nature expresses a design of love and truth. It should also be stressed that it is contrary to the authentic development to view nature as something more important than human person. This position leads to attitudes of neo-paganism or new pantheism. Human salvation cannot come from nature alone, understood purely in a naturalistic sense. We can't avoid both separating and combining humans and nature for the convenience of policy advocacy anymore. We are part of nature. So who are we? Well, I go back to Teilhard to get an explanation on this again. I think we're nature becoming conscious of our own design. There's an awful lot of issues involved with that we could discuss. Teilhard once also said that for my part, I don't believe in the supreme effectiveness of the instinct of preservation and fear. It is not fear of perishing, but the ambition to live, which has thrown man into the exploration of nature in the conquest of the atmosphere and the heavens. Finally, my last suggestion. We need to move from the passive acceptance to active choosing of the level of risks. What do I mean? How we make decisions about risking in water are central to the health of democratic political culture and individual freedom. I put John Stuart Mill in the funeral oration of Pericles up here because these are the classical definitions of why democratic culture is important. You create citizens who choose and who have the capacity to choose because essentially you make better citizens. That's the argument. It means, practically speaking, for the policy world, we need to move from a kind of a paternalism, whether that's the old engineers telling everybody we're going to take care of you, or the new regulators who say, be quiet, we're going to tell you everything you need to do. We need to move from the paternalism to a sense of informed consent. It's interesting, the American Society of Civil Engineers guidelines on what informed consent actually means parallel almost exactly those for public involvement. So I would look at the adaptation as opposed to the mitigation as a critical issue. It really is a pastoral response to the problem that we're talking about. And in a sense, the engineering is a means in this pastoral metaphor that I have raised here. If you think about it, those of us in the water world, in the world water community, are now talking more and more about a real fear that we have. That is that the discussion of mitigation, not that people are against mitigation, not that they're against dealing with the issues that have been raised, but this almost obsessive concern is beginning to seem like no money, no interest, no focus, no talent is going to the adaptation. The truth is, no matter what we see about variability or causes, or how much we see it changing or not, if we don't deal with adaptation, under any of those scenarios, a lot of people are going to die, a lot of people are going to starve, and we have the capacity to help them. I think that Taft Broom some years ago on talking about the difference in engineering and science and what it means to ethics is quite interesting, and I'd like to quote here. Engineering is always an experiment involving the public as human subjects. This new view suggests that engineering always oversteps the limits of science. Decisions are always made with insufficient information. In this view, risks taken by people who depend on engineers are not really the risks over some error of scientific principle. More important and inevitable is the risk that the engineers, confronted with a totally novel technological problem, will incorrectly intuit which precedent that worked in the past can be successfully applied this time. Interestingly, these new moral dimensions are not being created primarily by philosophers. They are the work of the engineers themselves. To conclude, from over 2,000 years ago, Lao Tse offers some interesting perspective. The sage's transformation of the world arises from solving the problem of water. If water is united, the human heart will be corrected. If water is pure and clean, the heart of the people will readily be unified and desirous of its cleanliness. Even when the citizenry heart is changed, their conduct will not be depraved, so the sage's government consists of talking to people and persuading them family by family, and the pivot of this work is water. Thank you very much.